Hello everyone, I'm Girish Reddy and today we are going to discuss some secrets of pawns. Pawns might be the weakest piece on the chessboard, but pawn holds a lot of secrets. And today we are going to uncover some of the basic secrets of the pawns. So this video will be divided into two parts. The first part will be the structure of the pawns and the second part will be the value of the pawns. So let's begin with the first structure. So this structure is a connected pawn. We call them as a connected pawns, and connected pawns we call them as best friends. So why connected pawns are called as best friends? Because one pawn can protect another pawn now or in future positions. So pawns are basically meant to protect another pawn. So that is how we call it as a connected pawn or a strong pawn. So I will give you a basic example here. So now this rook is attacking the pawn. This pawn can simply be protected by pushing one step forward. And if this rook tries to attack the b2 pawn, this pawn can simply be pushed and it can be protected by another pawn. And the rook, if it goes back to a6 and if it tries to attack on a3, now this pawn can be pushed and it can be protected. So this one, we call it as a connected pawns. So we shall go to the next pawn structure, but we have to remember connected pawns as best friends. Now, let's go to the next structure. Now, this type of pawn, we call it as double pawn. So we have to remember that double pawns are weak. And why double pawns are weak? Because if there is any attack on the doubled pawn, then this pawn, the pawn which is on f2, cannot be protected by pushing the pawn. If we have to push the pawn one step forward, the pawn which is front should be moved first and then the pawn which is behind. And we can see that we don't have enough time and then we will be losing this pawn. So this is about the double pawn. Now coming to the third structure, we call this as an isolated pawn. So isolated pawn in a game of chess, we call it as our enemy. So if we have isolated pawn, it is our enemy and it is very good for our opponent, which means it is the best friend of our opponent. So a2 pawn is an isolated one and we call it as isolated because no other pawn is protecting. All right, even though some other piece might be protecting the pawn, but if no other pawn can protect in future or it is not protecting at present, if these two conditions apply, then we call this as a isolated pawn. So now, in this position, if you see, this rook is attacking the pawn. Now, the pawn cannot be protected by another pawn. And this pawn, if some pieces are protecting, let's say the queen or the rook is protecting the white pawn, then that piece should stay there to protect the pawn, which means if the rook is standing here, the rook has to stay here forever to protect the pawn. If the rook moves, then the pawn will be captured by the black rook. So what does this mean is the rook is tied up and you won't be able to use your own rook. So because of this, we call isolated pawns as weak pawns, weakest pawns, or our own enemy. And in the last position which we were discussing, here if you see, this is not an isolated pawn because this pawn can easily be protected by the another pawn. All right, so here this is the only one isolated pawn. Now let's move forward. We have discussed about the pawns structure, basic structure of the pawns. Now we shall discuss the values of the pawn. The values of the pawn keeps on increasing as we move towards the center of the chessboard. For example, so now these are the pawns. So now as we move towards the center of the board, the value of the pawn keeps on increasing. Yes, I know that all the pawns have only 1 point, but still they are of different strengths. To make it much simpler, let's give them some amount or let's give them some money. So now this is the rook pawn. We call this as what? The rook pawn. And rook pawn, let's give it as 10 rupees. Now going to the knight pawn. So knight pawn is having 20 rupees. All right, as we are moving towards the board, we are increasing the amount. Then coming to the bishop pawn. So bishop pawn is 30 rupees. And then coming to the center pawn. So center pawn are the strongest and we give them 50 rupees. Okay. So with the help of this, we can easily understand that the weakest pawns are rook pawns. Why? Because they have 10 rupees, and the real reason we shall understand in another video why the rook pawns are the weakest. And the strongest pawn, we can easily understand that these are the strongest pawn, that is center pawns. All right, now we have understood the values of the pawn and structure of the pawn. Now how to apply them in the game? We shall look at few examples and then we shall conclude the video. So the first example is Queen's Gambit. So most commonly played game is Queen's Gambit. So they play d4, d5, and then comes c4 pawn. So when this c4 pawn is played, what white is saying is, hey black, you come and capture this c4 pawn. Once you capture this pawn, I am giving you 30 rupees pawn. All right, I am giving you 30 rupees pawn and I can capture your 50 rupees pawn by playing my e4 pawn. So I can capture this pawn in future. So if this happens, then what is happening? You can easily see that white has 250 rupees pawn and black has only 150 rupees pawn. So with the help of this, you can say that your pawns are at good condition or your pawns are having good health. All right, now let's move to another example. In this example, this is a famous opening. This is a French opening. In this situation, here, white generally plays pawn to c4. Sorry, I'm sorry. Here, black, it is white's turn. White plays knight f3 and black plays pawn to c5. And why pawn to c5 is played? Because here, if white tries to capture the pawn, then black is very happy because black got 50 rupees pawn and black will enjoy that. So if you see, white has only 150 rupees pawn and black has 250 rupees pawns. Yes. Now let's move to the next structure. Yes, in this position, we shall see now what happens after knight captures this bishop. Now it is your move. With which pawn are you going to capture? With the f pawn or with the h pawn? So here h pawn is having 10 rupees and the f pawn is having 30 rupees. All right. So the answer here is with the h pawn. Why with the h pawn? Because now our 10 rupees is getting converted into 20 rupees. So our value of the pawn is increasing, because of which we will capture with h pawn. All right. Now let's move to one more example. This will be the last example and we shall conclude. Here it is black to play. So black will try to capture this knight. Now you have two options. You can capture with b pawn or you can capture with d pawn. So with which pawn are you going to capture? So if your answer is with the b pawn, I'm sorry to say your answer is wrong. Here we have to capture with d pawn. Even though our 50 rupees is converting into 30 rupees, we still have to capture with this pawn in most of the cases, because here we give preference to the connected pawns. If b pawn captures the c3, then there creates an isolated pawn. We know that isolated pawns are our own enemy. So we don't want to create our own piece as an enemy. So we are capturing d pawn. Yes, there is a double pawn created. But even if we capture with the b pawn, there is a double pawn creating. So we have to capture with the d pawn so that we are maintaining the pawn structure and not creating any isolated pawn. So yes, coming to the conclusion of the video. So after this, we have learned that we have to give more preference to the structure of the pawn And then we have to look to the value of the pawn. And finally, different positions in chess demands different strategies and consideration. So what all we have learned will be applied most of the time, but it won't be applied universally. So play carefully, apply these strategies in your game. See you in the next video. Bye bye.